Tashile. My name's Dragpa. Just doing some quick video clips reflecting on things that are important kind of to me, that I think are kind of deeply significant, both in terms of Tibetan Buddhism and also in terms of living in a complex world in a way that's kind of nuanced and caring and interested enough to really kind of like appreciate and love that kind of rich overflow complexity. So the specific topic I'm reflecting on right now, just this morning, so this is very off the cuff, is directionality. My friend Jeremy Johnson recently was posing the question of can we keep meta narratives in a way that's non-linear or not stadial? So this is such a deep, rich question, and it's quite actively related to how complexity unfolds over time. And the typical Buddhist take is, how we engage reality experience is always going to depend on our view, on our worldview making. It's called tawa, or view, in Tibetan. And so this view making is actually what's going to define literally the contours of the world space we're in, how we see ourselves in the world, how we interact with one another in the world. It's all defined by the worldview, this present moment filtering system that's this infinitely complex, nuanced system of causes and conditions and effects coming together every moment in response to the world we're making, and it kind of folds back on itself to reinform the view we're holding to co-creatively make and participate in that world. So it's this view that kind of it creates a world, an ontology, and it's seen through an epistemology filtering system that then kind of creates the ontology, and it's constant kind of feeding back into itself, especially when it's a living worldview. It's not just a default mode network. It's not just a static, dogmatic set of beliefs and principles that we're largely unconscious of. And so this is related to Wilber's kind of integrative modeling, which can be said to be linear in some ways and nonlinear in others. At a certain point, I think we get to what's called an integrative, or a fifth person perspective mode, where we start integrating, like with the active interest, curiosity, and care, we start integrating different sets of ways of being, different sets of knowledge, different systems. So it's called systems of systems, this integrative, metacognitive way, like where we actually become passionate about, like, in a really fair, generous way, how does economics engage or like interlace with politics, and interlace with different psychological modalities, and interface with biochemistry, and like how do these different big systems like fairly and generously interact with each other? Like what are the connective deep tissue structures, communication patterns, relational kind of tendrils that interconnect them? And then when this mode starts turning on, which can be called fifth person perspective, in spiral dynamics it's usually called yellow or teal, when this integrative mode, this postmodern mode, starts turning on, and we start trying to honor multiple systems at once into greater comprehensive wholes, instead of privileging one system and then assuming it's the dominant, privileged structure, the discourse, the mode, the narrative that has fundamental privilege, and everything else filters through that. Instead of doing that, that's called pre-integral. Instead of doing that, we actually are moving between the modes. We're moving between systems. We're trying to hold as many systems in loving, careful ways. And so that's called yellow, or teal, or integral. Or in terms of Buddhist sense, I think this is where middle way, Madhyamaka view of Buddhism starts getting a lot of traction as a system that's really explored this in embodied ways for centuries now. It's explored this pivot point where all of a sudden we get conscious enough about self, other, and world, about self, nature, and culture. We get integrated enough with consciously, where we're starting with our awareness is starting to like choose how it's co-creatively participating in the different worlds that make it up and that it's a part of. And with that consciousness, that heightened awareness of this integrative mode unfolding in real time as like a lived experience, a lived playfulness, then that's when the stadial approaches start to get more nonlinear, or less stadial, less fixed, less privileged, less potentially hijacked by power dynamics. And this especially turns on when that integrative mode becomes more of a lived experience, where we're no longer just seeing, like analytically, apart from seeing different systems and how they might relate, as if like we're not a part of that and we're going to just on paper figure out with quadrants and maps and models like how things might line up. That's yellow or teal. The next more maturing opening of that approach is in spiral dynamics called turquoise. It's this more mature integral approach. And that's where I think in Buddhism it starts to really talk about middle way, or the lived kind of heart pulse. The impulse of the middle way view is bodhicitta, heart mind of enlightenment, where we're trying to multi-care for all the living threads that we're a part of that make us up, including others and their perspectives and their way of making sense. And so this is a multimodal or a polymodal, or you could say a nonlinear or a more mycelial, this more multi-pathway enfolding sets of wholes start turning on, because we start trying to show up inside someone else's world making system in a way that mutually blends with our world making systems. Where are the threads that honor the valuable aspects as much as we can of both of those systems coming together in a lived way? We start really trying to live the whole set of internested embodied perspectives and experiences and bodies and worlds that make up a seamless integrated whole, which is a present moment. We start actually enjoying trying to live the spiral. Instead of just cognitively seeing spiral dynamics, we start trying to embody and playfully move within the spiral. And that also means do the hard work of seeing the parts that we're not aware of or where we're stuck, these negative, destructive, self-destructive, other destructive habits we have, different parts of a spiral we're still fighting against. We still have pre-integral or like non-integrative impulses where we want to still cut out certain aspects of reality, of cause, condition, and effect, that we're just not comfortable with because they're not as familiar. We don't have more space and kind of inclusive kind of embrace of those aspects, and so we kind of go to war with those perspectives in ourselves. At Turquoise, we're starting to really try to like embrace more of the aspects by becoming more aware of those spots, our blind spots, or different kind of quiet, not cool ways that we engage with realities. And trying to embrace them, trying to become more conscious, more inclusive, more whole, more comprehensive. So this is a living integrative impulse. This is like lived integral instead of just like thought integral. This is where it's not, this is where bodhicitta like starts to really turn on, the heart mind of enlightenment. We start to really care about others deeply, about how others are feeling, how they make sense. And this is where it gets this is where polymath really turns on. We're asked to like thread together, weave together, and relax into these genius capacities we have. What Wilbur will point out as these all-qual aspects of every, tetra arising moment. These like layering stages or like developmental kind of sheaths, these states of awareness, these lines or multiple intelligences, these shadows are the ways we're unconscious to like bring light and fresh vibrant energy to them. These quadrants, the subjective, objective, intersubjective, and interobjective modes, like the lived subject object enfolded in group live quadratic experience. Like these are just different contours of a living world, and we're starting to try to really cue into all of them because they already are cueing into each other, making up these wholes of bodies and relationships and world systems. In bodhicitta and middle way view, we get enough spaciousness and clarity, precision, to really actually start to care for all these moving parts of this larger symphony that we're always a part of. We start to try to not just conduct it as if it has to go my way. We start to surrender to the living, frothing multiplicity of the symphonies, co-creating with other symphonies in these ever-expanding greater wholes of inclusion. And so at that point, it gets nonlinear, or it gets multi-perspectival enough, or it gets integrative enough, or kind of however you want to label it. And the beauty of Tibetan Buddhism, having like had bodhicitta, this base level of turquoise, as its like beating heart impulse of what Tibetan Buddhism is, like the only way you can enter Tibetan Buddhism properly is to activate this bodhicitta aspect, which means pull yourself into an integrated whole of turquoise, like healthy, mellow, mature integral, on now in real time, and then you allow the multiplicity of your experience, the self, the other, the world, to be an expressive um, opportunity to love full spiral dynamics. And that's where Tibetan Buddhism starts. So it starts at turquoise, and then it allows like the full layered frothy beauty, truth and goodness and all that, like of reality, to really start to co-creatively intermix. And so there's really practical examples of this. And the one I go to so many times is the Nyingma Tibetan Buddhist lineage tradition of like these internested nine yana systems, as 9 vehicles of study and practice. They're literally these internested systems of philosophies and enacted transformative practices, meditations, that include these layered ecologies, or these layered views, these layered worldview map making kind of systems, these integrative webs of greater and greater wholes. This is what the Nine Yana system is. Um, and so it's this example we have that's like overflowing with um, like lived kind of ways of actually being this, of being interpretive, of living turquoise. It's done this for centuries, according to how the Buddha taught. There's always human beings, there's always Buddhists that aren't following Buddhism. Like there's always that distinction between what is how an awakened being like a Buddha Shakyamuni actually lives and sees and breathes and is, compared with the followers who we're fumbling over ourselves, making mistakes and having all these human biases and chauvinisms and stuff. Like our fundamentalist tendency to like still locking up in the spiral and fighting against aspects of our being and becoming and doing. There's still that. There's a difference between the Buddhist and Buddhism, what the Buddha taught, and actually how the Buddha was and experienced things in ways that weren't dumbed down, or he didn't make more digestible according to the smaller, more narrow view of the being he was with. So this is called provisional and definitive. In Buddhism, provisional means um, how the Buddha had to kind of like simplify like the like overwhelming complexity of cause, condition, and effect that he was aware of, how he had to simplify it into more bite-sized bits that were suitable for the people that he was engaging with. That's called provisional. And then definitive is like how the Buddha actually experienced it without having to dumb it down at all. Like if Buddhas are just chilling out, like how do they communicate with one another in ways where they don't have to, create a cartoon version of their experience in order to be on the same page? They're just Buddhas and Bodhisattvas like hanging out relaxedly. They're not having to make an approximate kind of caricature of what they experience. They can just directly, definitively just share and co-create with each other. So that's a provisional definitive distinction. And so through the Nine Yana, this multi-layered series of internested world making, which is the Nine Yanas, then the more outer, the more external, the more obvious, the more literal is like the more base level or root level, more foundational structure. So that's like level 1, Theravada, foundational Buddhism. So at level 1 is like the heart impulse, the heart. And then level 2 includes 1 but goes beyond it. Level 3 includes 2 and 1 and goes beyond them. So this is the basic integrative mode of like including the valuable and like transcending or going beyond the limitations of the more foundational layers. So this is the basic integrative or transjective. This is the directional impulse to include more and transcend the limitations that hold back that inclusion. And there's 3 features that Nyingma Tibetan Buddhism and the Nine Yana system taught for centuries, according to Mipam, Great Jama Mimpam Rinpoche, Longchenpa, Guru Rinpoche, the Buddha, all these great masters. There are these 3 principles of directionality, and they are clarity, completeness of detail, and direct expression of the nature. So this is like the clarity of the view, how much rich detail, when you like have that clarity, how much detail, granularity can you include? And how directly is that expressive of the nature as it is, instead of being filtered in these more approximate provisional ways to match lesser, more narrow views? Lesser meaning more narrow, less inclusive. Like, not bad, just like smaller, like more tightly knitted, more like surrounded by these kind of mistaken duality habits. Like, so that's directionality in Buddhism according to Nyingma. It's like how clear is it, how complete is it, and how directly expressive of the nature is it? And that's actually how you define like how the trajectory of the layering of like what's yana or vehicle 1, 2, 3, 4. Vehicle 4 is more clear, complete, and direct than vehicle 2, for example. Vehicle 9, which is Dzogchen, is the most clear, most complete, and most direct. They call it all complete, great completion, Dzogchen. And so what does that mean in terms of how we experience these worlds overlapping in a stadial or a directive way, as if there's one way to do it? So what happens at a larger yana? It can work on the assumptions of the sub-yana, of the foundational yana, but goes beyond those assumptions by refining them. It refines the assumptions. And this is the key thing related to Jeremy Johnson's inquiry, which is such a beautiful inquiry. Like, can we have meta-narratives that don't assume a stadial framework? They don't assume a fixed directional linear way of being. And this is what the Nine Yana systems do. Like in level 1, we assume there's a mind and a body. There's these 4 internested philosophical systems in Buddhism. Like level 1 is level 1 we're assuming is Vaibhashika. We're assuming there are fundamental irreducible units of space and time. And space is fundamentally made up of units of, what is it called? Units of mind and units of matter or material. So non-material and material. And time is made up of, is also seen as irreducible units. It's like there's an irreducible unit of time. So this is like very much related with almost any empirical scientific modality now. People are assuming there's some irreducible unit of space and time. And they just aren't agreeing on what's that ground level layer. That's what they're looking for, a theory of everything. What is the fundamental unit and what's an elegant theory that brings together that unit in a full expressive capacity of how it can combinatorially, explosively create all the things we experience at all scales. So they're trying to find that theory of everything. And this level of Buddhist philosophy by Vaibhashika assumes there are irreducible units of space and time. And so you can say also irreducible units of mind and body. Okay, so that's another way at this level of philosophy. Body is made up of space and time. Mind is made up of units of mind, like a moment of mind, and units of a felt sense of me, like the lived interior felt sense of mind. So these are the 4 things that make up of all reality at this Vaibhashika level. This is just an example. There's irreducible units of space, irreducible units of time, and then on the inside, mind side, the subjective side, irreducible units of mind and irreducible units of the felt experience of awareness. So this is assumed at Vaibhashika, this foundational level philosophy of Buddhism. And at the next layer of Buddhist philosophy, it refutes this. It refutes these fundamental assumptions. It says there is no such thing as given space and irreducible units of space and irreducible unit of time. And there's also not an irreducible unit of mind. What we have is, that view, this next view, Saltantrika, philosophical view, it says if there is mind and there is body, there is material and non-material, like they can't directly interact with each other because they're different in kind. And so what you have is a representational theory of philosophy, like in analytic Western kind of European philosophical terms. You have a representational theory that's relating to these fundamental isness or this always unreachable real experience. So you have our mental mapping of the lived experience it's trying to map, and there's always a gap between like what the representation is and what is being represented. So it's still assuming there is this base layer, super subtle base layer of these like universal givens that we can never accurately map, because all our representations are only going to ever be maps or models. They're approximate. They'll never be the actual lived reality. They're a mapping or a representation of it. So it's not the same thing. It's always approximate, or like a cartoon. And so they say however much we can match up the mapping with these fundamental, ever unreachable, like irreducible, like true isness, like however close we can get that according to the Buddhist teachings and these Lineage masters, that shows like that our system is becoming more accurate. And so that's the second layer. And so the point here is that um, it's the second layer revises the fundamental first principles of the first layer. Like that's why it's a more inclusive, that's why the directionality is there, to be more clear, complete, and direct, because it's revising the first principle assumptions of the foundational, that it's the foundation that it's a part of. And by revising the first principle assumptions, it actually creates this more inclusive, integrative, comprehensive worldview or view, this world making. And so we see more of the world, more of ourselves, more of the others in the world we're sharing it with, and the relational patterns between self, other, and world. We get more of the procedural, processual, ongoing, live, frothy experience of cause, condition, effect, or relationality, relationship, relative truth. We include more, and so it's more inclusive. So it's level or layer 2. So this is a stadial thing, but it's not oppressive. Okay, and then in the third yana, the third system, it's called mind-only school. It refutes the fundamental assumption that there is this non-material reality and there's a material mapping version, like representation of it. It says these are also different in kind, non-material, material, or material, sorry, the base, and non-material. Because these will never interact, they're different in kind. It's actually a mistaken assumption that they're these two different things, material and non-material. What this mind-only school says is they're both mind. They're both mental in nature. Both the world we're in, our experience of the world, our felt sense of self, all these things we assumed were irreducible units of space, time, self, and felt sense of self, these are all just mental, they're mental habits. So there's awareness filtering us through self through layered patterns of mental habit, bhakcha. And so you have mind engaging with mind, and other minds are there, and their minds are filtering through their mental habit layering contours that have just been accrued or like locked in place through grasping, through repetition over time. So we have these minds interacting with each other through the layered mental filtering systems that the minds are assuming. That's mind-only school. But they assume there is this fundamental mind. There are these minds. It's Buddhism always has a plurality of mind. There's never one single mind. That's a specific thing in Buddhism. It's always minds. There's different sentient awarenesses. But how much we lock into our habits of mental patterning, that defines like the worlds we seem to be experiencing, like how much we grasp onto our sense of self and other, meaning the ways we're mentally filtering sense of self and other, are the ways that our awareness kind of streams through itself and reflects back to itself. That defines like the contours of a sentient experience of my body and my awareness and my world. It's the grasping, like how much we're assuming these patterns of mind to be given independent of our mind. And so that's what this middle way Madhyamaka next level philosophy addresses. It says there is no fundamental awareness there. There is no such thing as a fixed mind. And so at this level of middle way philosophy, it posits, like its assumption is there's no such thing as a fundamental entity that is truly existent. There is no such thing as something singular, independent, and permanent, whether that's a mental thing or a material thing. There are no such things as irreducible units of space or time or mind or the felt experience of mind. That's all illusory or provisional. They're approximate. The Buddha taught those things for awarenesses, for views that couldn't yet go beyond that way of holding. They had to hold on to something. So the Buddha kind of dumbed it down into a more provisional, like, child, usable thing, even though it's super sophisticated. The first level of philosophy is like all empirical science we currently have. But the Buddha dumbed it down as if there's entities. There is a world. There are beings in the world, like container and contained, habitat and inhabitants. There are relational units. There are relational felt sense experiences. And these entities are temporarily assumed provisionally in order for the minds that assume them to relax and see the limits of those assumptions and refine those assumptions to have better assumptions. And eventually to directly express the nature without any assumptions. No fixed duality pattern holding. And this is what middle way Madhyamaka is pointing to. This is all still within Sutra Mahayana. You look at a Nine Yana system, this is at level 3. Level 1, 2, 3. and there's still goes into 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So level 3 is this fundamental mid-away Madhyamaka view. This is where fifth person perspective starts turning on. If we're looking like how Tibetan Buddhism view fits with the integral sectarian view, or not sectarian, secular, sorry. The integral secular view, this is where fifth person perspective turns on. You start being able to see systems of systems, or fifth person perspective. You can see the Vaibhashika way of functioning, and you can use it if it's helpful. You can see the Sartantrika way and use it as helpful. Do I want to posit units of body and mind? Do I want to use a representational correspondence theory of reality? Do I want to use a mind-only idealism kind of adjacent way of being? Do I want to use a total free-flow integrative, like assume the different worldviews someone's working with and like kindly point out the limitations of it and let the cognition, the internal self-aware pristine nature of mind, to for itself auto-enhance, to auto-poetically see more clearly, brighten, and open into a way of being that doesn't have to hold on to fundamental units of space, time, self, or felt sense of self, that doesn't have to assume certain grasped onto assumptions as if they're really real. They're just temporarily there. So Midway says it's all temporarily there. It's not singular, it's plural. It's not independent, it's dependent. It's not permanent, it's always impermanent. And this way of being, this middle way of being, is the fundamental assumption, this integrative fifth person integral mode, this yellow teal mode, starts turning on in a lived way, where then we start intentionally enjoying our embodiment. Like we try to fully live into Vaibhashika, fully live into Svatantrika, fully live into mind only, fully live into middle way. And that layering is quite different than the typical secular, I'd say more Weberian integral ways that are assuming a certain stadial directionality. They still are, like in this very kind of fundamental way. Why? Because at this point, we have this lived felt experience of Bodhicitta, this middle way view in an embodied, embedded way that wants to actually have the whole spiral of internested systems of worlds like come together as the body, as the world making body of self, other, and world. We're trying to really inclusively bring together in greater, more comprehensive, more accurate, detailed, directly expressive, natural ways. We're trying to bring together larger and larger wholes. And so this is the fundamental difference between the integral approach as I know it, like according to Wilber's terms, and how Tibetan Buddhism lives it. Because the integral thing, it basically is saying if you get a healthier version of the spiral, like the root level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you just go in and make healthier versions, and you kind of align up and naturally sync up all these healthier versions. And spiral dynamics would be like healthy beige, healthy purple, healthy red, healthy blue, healthy orange, healthy green, healthy teal, like teal yellow, healthy turquoise. Once you get these, do the shadow work, and you like see the unconscious grasping habits and you integrate them into like healthier wholes, eventually you get this healthy spiral. And that is the fullness of reality expression. And then the question is just trying to integrate wakefulness, waking up, where you can see the absolute, always present, like shimmering emptiness, this expansive, spacious, like boundless entitylessness, this no fixed perspective, elegant perspective fluidity, right? So at this point, that's how Wilberian Integral sees it. And I think that's actually the definition of healthy sense of self in terms of Tibetan Buddhism, which is step 1. You like go through the spiral, you have healthy purple, healthy beige, healthy red, healthy all these layers. You get it healthy enough. So it's approximate, it's provisional. You don't have to be perfectly healthy in all these layered ways. Only a fully enlightened, awakened, fully expressive embodied being is like at that point. But you get these healthy enough layers, healthy enough purple, healthy enough red. So healthy enough, then we can go through spiral dynamics and really give granular detail there, but you get healthy enough up to teal, yellow, fifth person perspective. And at that point, that's the embedded healthy sense of me, of awareness. And that's when you start applying skillful means of Vajrayana. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean we are just going back at that point and doing the work to make our purple healthier, our purple kind of foundational layer healthier. We've already done that. That's the healthy sense of me, this relational, fluid, flowing sense of me, which Maitreya said in Uttara Tantra Shastra, that's actually called the great self. The self beyond self and no self is great self. This is like all Buddhism. It's not Advaita Vedanta, this is Buddhism. Maitreya taught beyond self and no self is a great self. Beyond impermanence is great permanence. Beyond suffering and pleasure or bliss is great blissfulness. Beyond impure and pure is great purity. These are the 4 definitive features the Buddha taught in his Buddha nature teachings, which is called for Buddhists the 3rd turning of the wheel of Dharma, pointing out the Buddha nature, how the Buddha nature functions when it's actually in a lived, integrative, middle way, like free flow, inclusive mode that's not assuming fixed entities of any kind. Then they say it's great blissfulness, great self, great permanence, great purity. These are the definitive characteristics, which are the opposite of the way of holding thus far, anicca, dukkha, anatta, nibbana. That's actually, so the Buddha taught both these. When we hold really tightly, we get impermanence, suffering, anicca is impermanence, dukkha, suffering, anatta, no self, nibbana, the cessation of suffering. Like when we hold in a more integrative way, we get their opposites. All of a sudden, when we hold these assumptions in less mistaken ways, we actually get not self or no self, great self. Not suffering or no suffering, great bliss. Not impermanence or permanence, great permanence. Not purity or impurity, great purity. This is called Tantra. This is where Tibetan Buddhism starts, with a 3rd turning Buddha nature teachings. Then we start integrating these larger layered skillful means techniques. What does that mean? We're using all the different threads of the spiral as ways to, like, in an embedded, embodied, extended, like very multi-polymath, like super nonlinear, like inclusive mycelial way, we start living through all these different worldviews, and we're shifting according to like what's optimal for all the people involved and however much I can hold. What's mutually uplift? What's the omni-win? What's the Bodhicitta impulse? And so at that point, that's when we get integral purple, which isn't going back and healing my purple wounds. We already did that. That's establishing healthy sense of self. We're getting from that Bodhicitta view, what's the like pure way, what's the Tantra way of experiencing the purple layers, the red layers, the orange layers, the blue layers, and that's called integral purple, integral red, integral orange. So at this point, it's not going back to the sub things that make up the healthy sense of me. It's using that greater sense of bodhicitta to actually weave and lean into all these pure worlds, these next layered, next level, next more integrative, non-linear, super counteractive dynamical systems of all these different layering ways based on different fundamental assumptions being held into greater wholes of clarity, of directness, and of completeness. And this is Tantra. That's where in the Yana system 1, 2, 3, 4, that's when 4 is when Tantra starts. And then layers 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that's all Tantra. So this is all how we can include all these layered modes when we have a very healthy, robust sense of spiral of me that's not fighting against itself, trying to cut out its own body parts. It's trying to live through the fully layered, boundless, inexhaustible, expressive genius capacity of being a being in worlds that are literally without fixed definitive frames. Emptiness, middle way. Tantra that's when that starts. And so then you can look at Tibetan Buddhism as like a modeled example of like how that actually plays out in culture, in nature, with beings over time to create skillful means, kind of these ways of practicing transjectivity, of practicing flex flow, of practicing the middle way, of like living it as a living approach. That's called the way of the Bodhisattva. And we're using these skillful means to use our sounds, to use our bodies, to use our mental, emotional things, all the movement threads of the spiral. We're using it as ways to like actually include more fullness of reality. We're spaciously, the empty side, the absolute side, we're spaciously including more detail, more inclusively, more directly expressive of true nature, of non-fixating awareness. And we're like weaving it together in greater wholes. And like which view actually gels into like the one we're living in now, which one becomes the stadial, like directive, linear mode now, it's what's most helpful for like the shared game, the shared dream that I'm a part of with others. But it's only temporary. We temporarily assume a stadial mode to line up with a world system someone else is in, that what's available with ours and theirs, and this creates a set of patterns, a set of rules, a set of fundamental assumptions that are temporarily held, like the rules of tennis. We temporarily hold those rules while we play that game of tennis. Then the game ends, then we assume new rules, and now it's basketball. And so the good faith dynamic is we can't change the rules mid-game. That's like a pathological, nihilistic, extreme postmodern, or extreme relativist position. You can't change the rules of the game mid-page. Like in Buddhism, that's like you lose the debate. The beginning of a debate, in good faith, you're like, we're agreeing to this object and this aspect of this worldview of approaching it. And within that worldview, you take this side, I take that side, and let's debate. But if in the middle of the debate, one, you're overwhelmed by emotions, or two, you change the rules mid-debate, you automatically lose the debate because you're cheating. You're like playing in bad faith dynamics. Like you're going out of bounds of that game. It was just a temporary provisional game. It was just a lullaby. It was just like an entertainment. And what happens for duality beings like myself is we forget the temporarily assumed assumptions, the temporary rules of the game. We forget it's a game, and we think it's actually these given real, like, fundamental contours of reality, these irreducible first principles, and they're not. It's just temporarily assumed mental habit flows. And by like seeing the temporariness, the embeddedness, the like actual dependent origination of all these different layered ways of patterning, then we can move between games, between language systems, between worlds more elegantly, more flexibly, and that's called middle way. That's the third layer of Tibetan Buddhism. In the Tibetan Buddhist Nine Yana system, that's the middle way. They say it's the most profound philosophical system, because it doesn't posit any entity, it doesn't posit any discourse. It just shows how every discourse is approximate, and then it lets the natural flow of experience be in a non-representational way. But then what Tibetan Buddhism adds onto that is a fourth yana, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, is it actively moves between all these different flow patterns of all the ways we can layer worlds. So this is like super polymath, super nonlinear, super mycelial, but it only does it in ways that are aligned with Omniwin Bodhicitta. So you have to like play the games you're a part of in good faith. You have to honor all the different wholes on their own terms. You have to like treat a heart as a heart, and treat lungs as lungs, and treat legs as legs, and treat, emotions as the emotions they are. You play the games in the ways that they are being assumed to be played, and you like relax into like greater webs of greater wholes of integrative kind of like wholeness as those become more and more available for a higher level, or more deeply layered, or more integrative wholes. So it's not a fixed stadial approach. It's a multi-pronged fluid approach that actually is trying to honor as many elements in the living system as it dynamically moves. And so that's the way of the Bodhisattva. And what Tantra adds, like I'm just kind of saying for a final time, is it's adding like more of like, okay, how can we see this in contracted, fundamental, like very mistaken assumption ways? That's called duality mind. And then as we're more operating and we're not assuming any fixed fundamental givens, no irreducible units of space, time, mind, or felt sense of me, as we actually are taking on others' perspectives in ways that like really genuinely, with a lot of longing and care and love, like try to embody and embed those. We're not just like steel manning them as like, that's a good model. How would that model work if I assumed it? What's right, what's wrong? We're actually trying to inhabit the different ways of being in different worlds, because we're like participating with others in a really active way. We're just also seeing that's just one way to participate, is provisional. There are these larger ways that are less provisional, more inclusive, and that's how the Nine Yana systems layer each other. We're like playing more and more games simultaneously. And so then Tantra, in addition to operating like from these fundamental fixed assumptions, it can see how to play those games, which are called nightmares. It can also see them as just like lucid dream-like temporary ways of holding. And so you get the samsara versions of like creating all these nightmares, the nirvana versions of creating really good like omni-win like fun games, and then you wake up from that with midway view of seeing free flow dynamics of just they're all games, they're all dreams, they're all hallucinations, they're all just like these provisional ways of flowing, of temporarily assuming rules, like carefully, like you don't break the rules, like you follow the rules according to like when they're being instanced and you move in and out of them flexibly in terms of what's helpful, what's omni-win. And Tantra just sees it adds like those are actually just dreams. If you wake up, there's this pure way of seeing things. Pure meaning when we get that integrative, all of a sudden we start seeing and experiencing and participating in things we didn't see before, which there are these other beings. There are wisdom beings that have been being, they're like relaxed into this mode, this wisdom way of being and making worlds and showing up with others. They've relaxed into this for eons, for countless time. They're all these enlightened beings. And they have, what are their worlds? Like the worlds they've woven together, the different communication, transportation networks, and all the different world system, like things, the chemistry version of how enlightened beings do chemistry, how do enlightened beings do economics, how enlightened beings do, you know, breathing process and like energy flow. Like what's the enlightened version and what's the unenlightened version? What's the grasping fixed version and what's the open fluid flowing version? That's called the union of Sutra and Tantra. And you bring that together as like the fixed nightmare and like only like beatific, beautiful, kind of obsessed luxury modes, the samsara nirvana modes. You start including both of them. That's called Tantra. And then there's all these beings that have like zoomed in and out and they're granularly like embedded in body, participating in all these different modes simultaneously. That's called an enlightened being. And there's all these micro, macro scales of all these world systems, of all these different varieties of types of beings that are have been doing this for countless time. So there's pure relative truth and impure relative truth. And so there's Buddha taught this both in sutras and tantras. There's so many different kinds of beings with different kinds of bodies and different kinds of languages and different kind of worlds and different kinds of lifespans. Like that's just subtle relative truth. And there's a pure, mistaken, enlightened way of seeing that doesn't assume fixed entities. That's called pure relative truth. And Tantra includes both of them. It plays both those classes of games, of dreams. And it does so in ways where it uses the threads of body, speech, and mind actively as like energetic ways of like playing any and every game simultaneously, only for the omni-win multi-benefit of the players, of the dreamers, like of all sentient beings. And that's what eventually we get to the ninth and final yana, great completion, which has, it's inexhaustible. There's no final edge. It's given that up. Like it just says like it's an endlessly adaptive, counteractive, dynamical system of internested worlds, internested beings, internested systems upon systems of systems of systems, all elegantly like free flow aligned according to cause, condition, effect, infallibly. And that Tantra just takes like the omniscience of a Buddha simultaneously can take all positions, all relative positions, which means it is an infinite set, all infinite positions without error or omission, and it sees the integrative free flow entitylessness, the middle way, like openness of all of them into ever expanding integrative wholes. So that's called two omnisciences of a Buddha, omniscience of relative truth, omniscience of absolute truth. So here I'm just like full speed ahead, layering some like sutra and tantra kind of totally off the cuff. And this is like a significant difference in terms of how Tibetan Buddhism is taught from a lineage perspective compared with how certain people are analyzing it from the outside. Like I would say Ken Wilber, of the genius that he's lined up, it assumes these kind of fixed stadial meta narratives in a certain way. And there is this, you have systems of systems, that's integral. Well, there's different ways of doing integral systems. There's a fourth yana way of doing integrative systems. There's a fifth yana way of doing systems of systems of systems of systems. Like there are these larger ways. It doesn't stop at being systems of systems of systems, and then you can just wake up in free flow with emptiness. Like there still are fundamental assumptions that are mistakenly being held through all the layers of the Bodhisattva bhumis. And so in Bodhisattva bhumi layer like level language, like we already at level 1 have the have the openness, emptiness way of being all the time interruptedly, but we still have these mental habits, these energetic habits of emotional obscurations and cognitive obscurations, to only be willing to play a certain set of games. And through each, as we go through the next layers of bodhisattva ability, of like our Buddha nature free flowing even more, these temporarily assumed mistaken habits of emotional habits and cognitive habits, they release. So these blockages release, and we have more inclusive free flow that's called siddhi, or like these up-leveled capacities that aren't typical of like fixed duality mind. And as we release and release more of these temporary habits to emotionally hold or cognitively hold, as if there has to be some outside, there has to be an inside, there has to be a sense of space, there has to be an abiding sense of linear time. Those are just cognitive habits. So the Bhumis, so the Bodhisattva levels, like release those habits, which means that emptiness includes more cause, condition, and effect, more different world making systems, more different inhabitants that are in those world systems. Like, and eventually we don't have any distorted provisional habits we're mistakenly holding. That means there's no more emotional obscurations, there's no more cognitive obscurations, and that's called full enlightenment or unsurpassed enlightenment. That's the 11th Bhumi Bodhisattva level. And that's where Tibetan Buddhism begins. Yeah, that's when we start using the skillful means of pure body, pure speech, and pure mind. So anyway, that's some off-the-cuff reflections on how we can have meta-narratives that are not fixed stadial or fixed directional kind of linear models. They're actually like polydirectional, or they're mycelial. They're non-linear. So the Nine Yana system's such a good example of how this works. If this is interesting, welcome to Buddhism. Buddhism is filled with this stuff. And it also does it a lot more clearly than I'm talking about, because it like really zooms into a certain world, a certain set of rules and patterns, a certain set of like fundamental assumptions, and it does it in good faith, and it really fills out the texture of that pattern system, and then it shows the limitations or the weaknesses, the like unfairly held assumptions of that game, that way of holding, and it eases and releases and relaxes those assumptions and becomes more integrative into the next layer, the next yana, the next view. And it does that very thoroughly with its philosophies, and it does it very thoroughly with its lived experience, its practice, its meditative, transformative practice to become a transjective, totally flexible, elegant, fluid flow, chameleon, shape-shifting being that never breaks faith. It always is rooted in the integrity, in the deep, omni-win, like super, super rich dignity of like foundational ethics at every layer. It only has omni-win. It never uses that heightened, more integrative systems awareness of like more and more sensitive attunement to all the living dynamics. It never uses it for its own benefit at the expense of others. It literally, at a certain moment of like when Bodhicitta turns on, you always put others first. It's technically, it says that you like see all beings as equal. You exchange self for other. You give others my good stuff, and you take on their bad stuff. You give them my happiness. You take on their suffering. And then the next layer is you see others as more important, as your fundamental fixed given from that point out. Others are more important than me. Not I'm so bad and others are good. It's like my nature is pure. My nature is Buddha nature. My nature is 100% perfect already. It has 100% genius capacity that's inexhaustible. And others, if other beings have that exact same nature, and all of a sudden we're not reserving all this energy about I feel so bad, I have so much guilt, I have so much shame, I have this unhealthy sense of me, this pathological blue, pathological purple, all that. We've gotten a healthy enough sense of me, this Buddha nature is on and bright and shining and flowing, that all of a sudden the energy we reserve to like have a healthier sense of me, we don't need to reserve that energy because we already have it. We have that ongoing sense of great blissfulness starts peeking through. And all of a sudden, all that extra energy and creative capacity is like totally directed towards all the beings that are around us and we're connected with. And we do this larger and larger scales, both first aspirationally, like because it's beyond our capacity to help all beings simultaneously, yet we like aspire to do that. And then as we actually engage it and we live it and we put it into action, we start living it. we have these omni open capacities called cities start to turn on, and we actually, that's when Tibetan Buddhism skillful means practices turn on. So there's some long-winded off the cuff, probably no one will listen to this, but this is all lineage aligned, like Nyingma lineage aligned Buddhism. I'm saying it in kind of some different ways, using different language sets, playing with different game rules in a certain way, like trying to make it more accessible for non-Tibetan Buddhist audiences. But this is like straight up lineage, Nyingma lineage view, right? I'm not changing anything, I'm not adding anything, I'm not mixing and matching different perspectives. This is like straight up Nyingma view. And I'm also kind of just like speaking fast to a camera and letting it go like in a free form way. So hopefully it's helpful. If it's not, I'm sorry. If it is, great. Use a part of it that's helpful. Then we dedicate the merit. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. The precious Bodhicitta, and those without it may it be generated, and those who have it may it never diminish, but always continue increasing. Deity, mantra, and dharmakaya are the nature of appearance, sound, and awareness, the pervasive kaya and wisdom display of the Buddhas. May practitioners of the profound and secret great perfection remain inseparable from the innermost one-taste awareness of wisdom mind. Love. Thanks.